It's now my great pleasure to introduce our closing keynote speaker. Our speaker is the co-founder and chief investment strategist at the Grantham Mayo Van Otterloo investment firm, in fact, one of the leading investors in the world. He's also the founder of the Grantham Foundation for the Protection of the Environment, which supports communication and collaboration in environmental protection, with an emphasis especially on climate change. He also just told me that he has recently been inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and I think you'll hear more about that in just a moment if I got the name right. It's also interesting, I think, to note that his reputation as an investor is for not following the herd in the financial market. And he applies that same style of thinking to thinking about climate change. So I think you'll be fascinated to hear what he has to say about climate change and what we can do about it. Jeremy Grantham.
Thank you. Getting dressed this morning, I said to my wife, what am I going to put on for this kind of crowd? And we covered everything from jeans and a T-shirt to what I'm wearing. And as I went out and looked for my hat, I thought, well, it's classic. It's the creative tension in my life, because yes, I'm a fat cat. I'm in the 0.01% and make disgusting amounts of money doing shuffling people's money around. But in my defense, it all goes into the fight to, is it save the planet or is it saving us? I'm never quite sure. I think it's saving us. And I drive a Jetta diesel, and so we don't chew up that much, fly too much, of course. And I thought the gap between my fancy clothes and my series of 4 hats was pretty good, so this is my prop. This one says the Nature Conservancy. They're the 800-pound gorilla in saving land and finally getting into climate work. And I'm on the board of directors, I'm happy to say, along with the guy, the richest Chinese in the world. What's his name of that fancy? Jack Ma, thank you. Oh, Ramsey, thank you. And then my second most favorite is this one that says, got dirt, get soil, which comes from Warren Buffett's son, and addresses one of the issues that we'll get to. This one that's moving up rapidly is the Hana Ranch, which the Grantham family bought in Maui, where we're going to do experimental farming designed to nurture the soil and still be around after the next oil crisis. And finally, my absolute favorite, given my position, Che Guevara. And that tells you how I felt about the recent elections. So we're going to tell a quick story about our problems with resources, especially oil and food, and with climate problems, especially how it impacts farming. Unless we're lucky, either climate or natural shortages, or both, are going to stress our economic system and probably result in some failed states. It may already have done that, mainly in Africa. And we can, on paper, prevent all of this from happening. What you probably don't understand is, first, how way off the radar screen of mainstream economics all of these issues and everything I say is. Economics typically assumes away all resource limitations in defiance or ignorance of the second law of thermodynamics. You can't put oil back together and iron definitely rusts. And second, you're probably not aware of how important oil is and has been to our current wealth and apparent success, and therefore how fanatically its use will be defended, even if it means denying the facts. Technology, on the other hand, is racing to help us, as is the unexpected declining birth rate. They may save us if, A, we get our politicians and the general public to appreciate the risks, and B, if we get lucky. Now a very fast survey of the race of our lives, which poses the first problem for me, that I can't read from that distance. Okay, to start with some relevant quotes, and these really are, I think, some of the best quotes in the business. First of all, Eisenhower, in his retirement speech, where he famously talked about being careful of the military-industrial complex. A remarkable thing for a general and a president to say. What is completely ignored is that in that speech, that very speech, this sentence is contained, which is never quoted. I wrote a paper on it. It still isn't quoted. You and I and our government must avoid the impulse to live only for today, plundering for our own ease and convenience the precious resources of tomorrow. I mean, that is magnificent. We haven't had that from any liberal president. And then FDR, the nation that destroys its soil, destroys itself. And Winston Churchill, talking about a similar situation that we face in climate before World War II, urging everyone to pay attention to Hitler and rearmament and being battered away for 5 or 6 or 7 long years. And finally, Hitler was showing his hand by invading Czechoslovakia and so on. The era of procrastination, of half measures, of delays is coming to its close. In its place, we are entering a period of consequences. Well, my God, doesn't that apply to climate? And then Kenneth Bowling, one of my few heroes in the economics world, an outcast practically, although he was a hotshot as a young man. He became an outcast for talking about Spaceship Earth and cowboy economics, and became quite disgusted with the fact that economics had lost its way and no longer was interested in being useful, but only in producing elegant mathematical hypotheses, really, since they're never based on the real world. And anyone who believes exponential growth can go on forever in a finite world is either a madman or an economist. It's beautiful, just beautiful. And then recently, James Galbraith, who has a book out right now, brand new, still hot, and it's called The End of Normal. And he says, there's no reason to believe that the democratic decision made by the living in the face of their present needs and desires will be the decision that would maximize the chance of long-term system survival. The unpleasant conclusion is that it is possible for a society to choose economic collapse. And if you're an environmentalist looking at the recent election, I think we took a step closer to choosing that. Finally, Bob Marley from Them Belly Full. Them belly full, but we hungry. A hungry man is an angry man. A hungry mob is an angry mob. You now practically know everything I have to say, actually. I said I'd start with the bad news and work up to the better news. 3 existential threats. The worst one is the frozen methane clathrates off the continental shelf of Siberia. As the Gulf Stream tickles up there and the waters get warmer, they can start to bubble up. It's frozen water, frozen methane, 100 meters down, and they are now identifying increasing areas of bubbly methane. If they produce what the scientists call a great methane burp. They have the potential to put more heating in the air than all the fossil fuels added together. And James Hansen is worth reading on this topic. It may easily happen. When it starts, it's out of our control. And you better have a farm, not in Maui, but in Greenland. Second, erosion has not been stopped. 1% of our soil disappears every year, globally. That gives us 100 years to fix it. But there are more downpours. The most dependable outcome of climate change is the increased incidence of very heavy downpours. There's a modest increase in droughts, 30 or 40%, as we see in Brazil and California. Any second now, Sao Paulo is off water. And a recent report this year from the UK said that by 2100, the English summer, poor thing, is going to have 4 or 5 times more heavy downpours. It turns out that erosion is a power law on downpours. 360 days a year, even including decent rain, there isn't much erosion. 75% of the erosion comes in the last 6 days a year. And the worst day or two is half of that. And the worst flood every 3 years is half of that. And it is precisely those kind of disastrous many inches in a day that is going to increase because of the increased water vapor in the air. The Devil and the Farmer is a contract I produced out of thin air in the Midwest. And the devil says he will quintuple the profits of the farmer if he signs the 50-year contract. And footnote 23 is that if he signs, he'll lose 1% of his soil, which is what we lose anyway, so he signs and makes a fortune. And when the devil comes back, his grandson or great-grandson, and all the neighbors' great-grandsons rush to the barn to sign up with the devil for another 50 years, and they make 5 times their money, and they are all happy as clams. And when the starving mob arrives from Chicago, at least they all die rich. Because at the end of that second contract, there's no soil and no food. Now, there is no Harvard Business School graduate who would not sign that contract. That is capitalism at its simplest and most obvious. You're given that contract, you goddamn sign. Your job is to maximize the return to your shareholders. You absolutely have no choice. You've got to sign. That's how modern capitalism works. And the third one is running out of phosphorus. Way off the radar screen. Modern ag needs several things that are limiting. Phosphorus is limiting. It's an element, you can't make it. There's no substitute. Every living creature, including you, needs phosphorus, and always will. And phosphorus is mined for big ag. In other words, here is a finite resource without which modern ag cannot function, that is depleting as we speak. And Morocco has 75%, plus or minus 10%, of all the phosphorus in the world, the most important pseudo or semi-monopoly in the history of man. Phosphorus comes from a dried-up ocean, and you either have a dried-up ocean or you don't. You can't expect it, like oil and gas, to be widely distributed, and it is not. And things get a little less bad from here on. Okay, resources. We created an index of 33 equal-weighted resources that matter, but equal-weighted. I wanted to get at the spirit of what was actually happening to the typical resource. And this is the price of the index. It declined 70% over 100 years, which is a huge help to getting rich. It declined at 1.2% a year. It went up in World War I and World War II. Why would it not? And then in the oil crisis, but then, bang, it went up again. From the year 2000 to 2008, it made a bigger move than World War II, but where is World War III? Nobody even talked about this. Oil quintupled, grains tripled, the Arab Spring was set off, and no one was even bothered. The world had changed. My paper on this that you can get free, gmo.com, is called Time to Wake Up. The age of plentiful and cheap resources is gone forever. This was the mother of all paradigm shifts. The probability that this was random for iron ore is something like 1 in 1.5 million. What was going on here is a struggle between scarcity and technology and innovation. And in the old days, up until recently, the productivity from technology has been about 3% a year. I have no reason to think it isn't continuing around 3% a year. The annual increase in costs, however, used to average minus 1.25%, and now have been going up at 7 to 10% a year. You can deduce from that the marginal costs pushing in the opposite direction to technology. In the old days, we used to gain 3%, pushing down the prices by being clever, and the fact that we had to drill deeper and use worse copper ore pushes the price back up, and we netted out a winner. From 2002 to 12, the game changed. We got the same productivity, but the cost push, as we began to run out of plentiful, cheap resources, pushed us back. Oil has been the great exception. Oil has never declined. For 100 years, it was flat at around $16 in today's currency. Hugely volatile, but basically flat. That was a wonderful trend. And then when OPEC started, a cartel, good time to have a paradigm jump. It jumped to about 35 bucks a barrel with exactly the same volatility that it used to have, but around a much higher base. And then in recent years, it jumped again, perhaps to 75 bucks. I met 1 year ago, I met second in command of a major European-based oil company, and with a couple of glasses of wine in a semi-environmental setting, he said when they're looking for any decent amount of new oil, they reckon on 75 to 80 bucks a barrel. Do not confuse the cost of getting oil out, which is the cost to global society, with the price. The price is local supply and demand, current supply and demand. If you have a little glut because of disappointing growth combined with unexpected fracking in the US, the price can go down a long way, all the way down to marginal cost of finding it, as opposed to the total cost of finding oil. What you're seeing today is just such a strange event. Good money-making opportunity. Of course, oil companies will have to stop new exploration, because if you're counting on $75 cost and you're looking at $75 oil, you do not borrow money to be a hero. You cut back. That's what will happen. Then there'll be a shortage. Then the price of oil will go back. Whether it takes a year or 3 years, I'm not sure. This is the story in oil. The bars are what we find. Massive amounts found in the 40s and the 60s, 50s, 70s, in the Middle East mainly. And the black line is what we produce. Since 1982, we have never produced as much oil as we found. And now you see, over to the right, the additions estimated getting lower and lower, and demand, of course, very slowly now working its way up for another few years. Total spending this year, $750 billion looking for oil. Far and away the biggest ever. And what did they find? They found 4.5 months of current supply, the lowest in 50 years. Absolutely shocking. The major oil companies spent 25 of the 75, so the big numbers of Venezuela and Saudi Arabia and so on. 25 billion. I'm sorry, 250 billion. 250 out of the 750. But you go back to 2005, and they spent 50 billion. This is almost, well, it's totally unprecedented in the oil business, a 5-fold increase in money spent looking for oil by the majors, and they did not pump any more oil than they did in 2005. The writing is on the wall here, and we just have to read it. This is the oil affordability. This is the story of modern capitalism. 1 hour worked by an industrial worker when I was born gained 20% of a barrel of oil, 8 gallons. Each gallon is 20 to 30 hours of human labor. He's rich. He's already controlling enormous quantity of physical labor. And then it went on a tear in the great income-producing era of American history. And by '72, on the eve of OPEC, the 1 hour worked now controlled 1.1 barrels of oil, or 46 gallons of 200 hours of human labor. My God. And then OPEC crushed it back to 0.2. And then we went on a much different leg up, where incomes were feeling the constraints of more expensive oil on one hand, and workers were now getting wealthier very, very slowly. And this was driven by a glut of oil as everyone responded with a time lag to the huge prices of the '70s. This is the point I want to make. The productivity, as we had more and more energy, and the energy intensity of each person increased. Every wave of technology had more energy. You bring on cars, you bring on televisions, TVs, iPhones, iPads. We're all obsessed with charging these things. You use power to get rich. And in the golden era, we gobbled up more and more power. Since then, the productivity deflated by CPI, which is a generous estimate of inflation, 1.1. Absolutely butchered the productivity. And since 2000, the great inflation point, it's 0.8%. We are watching the world constantly under stress from the loss of very cheap, increasing quantities of oil. Just imagine a world without oil and coal and natural gas, and you're back to 1.5 billion people. You've used up all the wood. We're back to sailing ships, canals. Science is limping along without any funding. We owe everything, in a nutshell, to fossil fuels. It isn't the steam engine and the brilliance of humans. It's coal and the steam engine. Without coal, the steam engine would have just hurtled us to using up every last stand of wood on the planet, and what I've written about as the great forest wars of the late 19th century, which we would have had. England ran out of wood in the 16th century. We were running out of wood everywhere. And that's where we would be. We'd be burning cow dung and cutting down the last trees. Even coal disappears, slips through the fingers much faster than you think. This is UK coal production. It started the Industrial Revolution. It runs out. And what is interesting here is that in the UK and Germany, they had estimates of billions of tons of coal reserves that vaporized about 10 years ago. They went from 2 or 3 billion to nothing. Why is the paradigm shifting now? That's when Malthus was born, and that's when I was born, two great figures in this field. And that is the global population. It's tripled nearly in my lifetime. And I am not 700 years old. This is quite the most remarkable exhibit, really, when you think about it. And why? China gobbles up the world. This is blown up so even I can see it. China last year used 58% of all the bags of cement used on the planet. Not traded, just used. Today, they're over 50% in coal. Over 50% of the whole world's use of coal. And iron ore, 48%. I mean, you can work it out. You back up 30 years, they didn't have 58% of cement, they had 4 or 5%. You better believe that this is a stress to the system. Moving on to, in the long run, a bigger problem. How are we going to feed 8, 9, or 10 billion people? This is the productivity of grain. It's magnificent, really. It starts in the Green Revolution over on the left. 3% a year. Every year, you're squeezing 3% more. In 3 years, you've got to get 10% more corn out of the same acreage. It's an amazing achievement. Not surprising that it comes down. and now it's running about 1.2. And the trouble with the 1.2 is that's the population of the world growing at, 1.2. Now, every year we squeeze out of our crops just enough to offset the growth in the world population. But this is another problem. The crop yields are topping out. These are the highest productive producers of wheat, and in the case of Japan, rice. They produce more per acre than anybody else, and the growth rate in the last 10, 15 years is practically nil. A recent report in Science Communications, Nature Communications, took 5 or 6 scientists and they tried to fit growth curves to all the major grain-producing areas of the world, and they basically agreed with Malthus. They said they could fit no exponential growth to any one of them. They were all arithmetic, which means that the growth rate gets less every year, asymptotically approaching 0, and that a lot of them looked exactly like that, asymptotes to 0. You can't squeeze indefinitely. Horses don't run faster today than they did in the 1920s. They break their legs more often. But they have had millions of dollars put in. And before that, they had 6,000 years of breeding. Eventually, there is a certain kind of hoarseness beyond which you can't go. Fertilizer drove the industrial, the green revolution. And it's increased by 5-fold. The green revolution was a type of grain that would grow faster if you could find more water for it and a lot more fertilizer. That's why initially it didn't work in India, because they couldn't come up with the fertilizer. But at a certain point, fertilizer works backwards and starts to hurt you. In China, it's way over the peak, and you have no more blood to get out of that stone. So the main drivers that proved Malthus early, not wrong, but early, was one, the availability of massive new areas of good growing land that he had not counted on. And second, the introduction of the basic fertilizers, which we now mine, except, well, nitrogen we mine, because we make it from natural gas. But other than that, and in between, you get diminishing returns. And now we've run out of land, we use it all. It's had a lovely surge after the 2008 spike, tripling in price. Everyone on the world brought in their reserved land. It's gone up almost 15%, having risen almost nothing for 30, 40 years before that. And we've run out of the fertilizer kicker, except in Africa and India to some extent. So we're deep into diminishing returns. This is peak phosphates, a nearly certain crisis because of this. Morocco, 50 billion tons. World, 65 billion tons. Now, we've got a lot of phosphorus, but it's 0.07% of the Earth's crust. This is not a lot. Potash, iron, aluminum, they're common. The least of those is 2.5%. If you take every other metal and phosphorus and add it together, it's not equal to the least of those three. It's not equal to 2.5%. Everything added together. And phosphorus is classic. It's 0.07. It is, if you look at what it takes to create life, it is far, by orders of magnitude, the scarcest thing in the universe. It is not widely distributed anywhere. It's not widely distributed on planet Earth, and Morocco's got it. Okay, moving quickly on to CO2 concentration. We know this one. We keep establishing the records, now 400 parts per million. It goes up like clockwork. It has basic, straightforward physical properties that acts as a greenhouse gas. Other things being even, the temperature will rise. And as temperature rises, you have more water vapor. And as water vapor increases, you have more storms, and you have more rainfall, and so on. And climate change, of course, has a raft of other effects, like the water level rising and so on, which I don't worry about. Who cares about Miami? But you have to care about heavy floods are taking away the last of our topsoil. Now that is serious. Far and away the most serious aspect of climate change. Forget anything else you read. All the others may look more graphic, but they are not as important. The temperature, of course, simply goes up. The skeptics are making a lot of fuss that it's gone a little flat at the top here. That is nothing. Look how flat it was at other times. From 1925 to 75, you have a 50-year period where the temperature appears not to be rising. And I say, who cares about that? The stock market, the S&P 500, has a 52-year period from 1929 till 1983 when it didn't go up. No one jumped around and said, oh my God, the trend of the S&P is finished. But they do with temperature because it's convenient, because there's a well-funded campaign of obfuscation and confusion by the very people you would expect to be defending their turf, which is the great oil interests on which MIT runs. Oh, sorry, I didn't say that. This is the volume of Arctic ice, which is much more impressive than the area. And you can see it's come down to about a quarter of what it was and falling fast. This is important because it's one of the reiterative cycles, self-reinforcing cycles. Ice reflects the sun. Dark blue water absorbs it. The more ice that melts, the warmer the water gets. The warmer the water gets, the more ice that melts. It's exactly like the methane problem that I described, except, frankly, much less important. But it's still, in the long run, a bit of a killer. This one is the Thwaites Glacier. It goes irreversible. There's something about going irreversible that concentrates my mind. I don't know about yours. This giant glacier, and the scientists have worked out with unusual confidence that this thing cannot be stopped. It is going, okay? It's a done deal. And when it goes, it will be several feet around the world. The good news is they don't know if it's 100 years or 500 years. And we may get lucky, but it's irreversible. And a lot of climate is irreversible. When birds go out of business, they're not coming back. You know, the carrier pigeon that used to take hours for a single flock to fly past, billions, believe it or not, were all killed off, but that's another problem. The Sixth Great Extinction, which is a great book you have to read if you can decipher the footnote, or Ramsey can tell you who wrote it. Elizabeth Colbert, thank you. Knew I could count on you. But this is the monarch butterfly. Ramsey runs our foundation single-handedly. Very efficient, very economical. One person. There's a lot of volatility in the monarch butterfly population, and they do it quite roughly by looking at the number of acres in Mexico where they roost. And the year before this one, they collapsed. Half an acre, half a hectare. This year, it's worse, as far as I can tell, in that on our garden, I saw one. And out in the fields, which are real big fields, I saw 7. I mean, we used to have dozens and dozens, scores, hundreds. You didn't think of counting them. This is our daffodil from 2 years ago, February the 7th. It was in bloom. This is not a lie. There's our little bean pods from our locust tree. And this is my sister's house, poor thing. In the great floods of London last year, the current was so strong out of her back door that her son had to put on a wetsuit, get a rowing boat, and come and take them to dry land. These things are becoming so common, particularly flooding. Droughts are very dangerous to agriculture, and they're increasing, and everyone can see that, but it's nowhere near the flooding. If you pick up the paper, you can't miss the flooding. Of the 9 greatest floods in New York since 1920, 3 were in the last 3 years. I mean, these are impressive, and if we get enough of these, I am hoping it will make people more serious, concentrate the attention, and you see it pick up. Half an hour. Okay, let's go. What this says, and I'm not going to read it, it says, whoopee, I got a piece in Nature that said, scientists, don't be so chicken-hearted. Get out there and say what you honestly believe, you miserable characters. Which got a huge reception, mainly good, but some really good negatives. And then I quote from some Dr. Raymer's work that was in the New York Times, where she's saying that there's all agreeing to 3 to 5 feet increase. But, she says, we've always discovered that the climate system is more sensitive than we thought it could be, not less. We've always done that. To which I was cheap enough to say, a normal statistician in the stock market might suggest that after serial underestimations, you do something to your darn model. But that is how it operates. Science works on what it can actually prove, taking strong tendencies in the data that suggest is not the style. 2 possible saving graces, which I really do believe in, and this is what makes it such an interesting and exciting race for the cliff edge. One of them is fertility. These are the developed countries where the fertility rate has come down from pretty high to below replacement. This is my favorite one line here, Iran. 7 children per woman, and it's now 1.6. I mean, this is just transcendently helpful. And there, all the superheroes, China and the rest of the guys, look like absolute heroes. Bangladesh, dirt poor, 2.1% down from 7. Amazing. And China and the Far East, of course, they have strong negative growth rates in terms of growing their ultimate population. And then you have Africa, which is like a separate system, inching its way down, becoming 100% of all the growth in the world pretty soon, on their way to billions of people on paper. Unfortunately, they will be overtaken by bad news. And this is the second and most dramatic of the saving graces, and this is technology. This is the technology driving down the cost in yellow of solar and in pale green wind, and the rising cost of coal as you have to dig deeper for less good coal. And they cross. In 20 to 30 years, there will be no new coal-fired utilities built, and most of the others will have been put out of business. And maybe in many countries there'll be a fairly hefty carbon tax. This will happen. We will muddle through energy. We will end up with enough cheap energy. The trouble is it 20 years or is it 45 years before we get there? It is absolutely vital to our system that is really stressed out by the lack of cheap energy that we get there fast. Today's solar doesn't address the problem. It displaces 120 barrel oil, or 100, even in the best sites. It's only when solar displaces 50 bucks a barrel does the economy really get the sort of jolt that it used to get from cheap oil. Now, I am going to have a 7-minute harangue that summarizes all of the above, given by my daughter-in-law, because by this time in these sessions, I get so carried away, I'm not capable of doing it. I will be back for Q&A.
Note these are his words. So if you start crying, go to him for Kleenex. It's the race of our lives. Today, we are in the race of our lives, and it is a finely balanced race. On one side, historians tell us that our current civilization, the first one to be truly global, has all the characteristics of earlier civilizations that failed: hubris and overconfidence, reckless use of finite resources, and little long-term protection for land and water and other natural assets. With the increased global population and the growing wealth of China, there is already remarkable pressure on resources whose prices, including energy and grain, are all up 2 to 4 times since 2000. Worse, the climate negatives are proceeding far faster than even Jim Hansen predicted in the 1970s. The CO2 count still rises, the climate warms, the weather destabilizes, making farming more precarious, the melting of Arctic ice and sea level rises accelerates. In the Antarctic, scientists believe the Thwaites Glacier has gone irreversible. However well we behave, it will collapse and add several feet to the existing estimates of long-term sea level rise. Irreversibility is scary, and very probably there will be more such cases that might include, at worst, some that are life-threatening. Indeed, time and possible irreversibility are our greatest enemies. Perhaps most dangerously, we are still losing 1% of our soil each year, even in the US. Compounding this problem, it is now estimated that an increase in very heavy downpours is a dependable outcome of the increase in water vapor in the atmosphere. The worst downpour each year can cause a quarter or more of all erosion. UK scientists estimate that there will be 4 times more of these extreme and even dangerous events, meaning that erosion could double. We will either profoundly change our agricultural ways in the next 50 years, or we will begin to starve. At the very least, food scarcity in poor countries will cause failed states and destabilize global politics, as it is doing already in Syria and Egypt. Marching into Tahrir Square, the crowd was chanting, "Bread, freedom, dignity. Bread, freedom, dignity." But bread was first. On the good side, we have 2 remarkable, perhaps undeserved advantages that no earlier civilization had. First, our fertility rate has dropped beyond Malthus's wildest dreams. Iran and Bangladesh had 7 children per woman in 1960. Today, they have 1.6 and 2.2, remarkable. If fertility stays moderate, it is a potential lifeline. Second, there is an ongoing explosion of technology in renewable energy and energy storage that is making these alternatives to fossil fuels competitive much faster than generally appreciated. In 20 years, solar generation will be far cheaper than fossil fuels. In 10 years, everyone will be able to see that electric cars are superior and that the gasoline engine is in its death throes. So both advantages and disadvantages accelerate. We may fail. At best, it will be close, but we can win. On paper, if we lived up to our theoretical capabilities, we'd have no problem. But in real life, both Homo sapiens and indeed capitalism, despite all its virtues, are not ideally suited at all to deal with the very long-term dangers to our air, soil, and water. Our worst feature, perhaps, is our willingness to protect our vested interests and political beliefs, regardless of long-term costs to society. This has resulted in deliberate attempts to promote more fossil fuel use and protect their subsidies while attacking alternatives. Deliberate programs to confuse the public on the science of climate change, creating doubt where none should exist and in most countries does not. And the bad guys, frankly, have been kicking our asses. They've been at it for 30 years. With huge assets to protect and money to do it, and with considerable cynicism, Exxon, for example, has prepared for years to drill in the Arctic, which requires the ice to melt, while simultaneously funding denial of the melting process itself. The bad news is that they have also executed their propaganda with considerable, even enviable skill. How good is their propaganda? I will tell you how good. In a society with universal suffrage, we are rapidly approaching the most extreme income inequality in modern times anywhere, and the lowest taxes on capital for 80 years. Most impressively for them, estate tax paid by only 2% of families is opposed by 68%. They have, in short, bamboozled enough poor voters so that with the help of a bizarrely right-wing Supreme Court majority, their money neutralizes the natural voting majority of the poor. Compared to income inequality, it has surely been much easier for them to confuse the general public on the complexities of climate risks and to fight against the use of new technologies so critical to our existence. Whether we approve of it or not, we are engaged in a propaganda war. It is absolutely vital that we environmentalists win this war. It will take money and leaders with talent and fire in the belly. We are threatened socially, economically, and most of all, environmentally. If we can't do better, our grandchildren will pay a very high price.
Thanks. So we may have time for a, who's the boss? Where's the boss? A few questions.
Thank you so much. It takes a moment to catch our breath from that, but I wanted to have a chance to ask a question. First, I want to say how much I appreciated seeing Kenneth Boulding's name up there. His late wife, Elise Boulding, also a force in her own right, was my dear friend and mentor, and is a large part of the reason I'm here today. What I wanted to ask you about is the we in that final sentence or that final statement, that we must win this communications or propaganda war. And my question is about strategies to expand the we in this country, starting in this country. I'm so concerned with the fact that this issue is still so deeply tilted toward the left. At the same time as we see data, for example, from Yale, indicating a real ripeness among moderate Republicans to care about this issue and to become part of a solution. So what I want to ask you is, what are the out-of-the-box strategies that you're seeing? And I should say, there are people working on this, like Energy and Enterprise, Bob Inglis, like Conserve America, from within like R Street Institute, within the conservative movement, working on this, but they're not getting far enough, fast enough. So I want to ask you, what are the out-of-the-box strategies that you're hearing about, seeing, supporting, or imagining to transform this issue in our country into a transpartisan or post-partisan issue that all of us, I'm not talking right now about skeptics, eventually skeptics, but not now, but people more in the center can embrace?
There are a couple of dozen new enterprises whose main job description is communications or propaganda. And they do deep investigative journalism. They think about what moves the voter, and we fund most of them. And we have, happy to say, got a good claim on this year's Pulitzer Prize. We paid to double the Center for Public Integrity's work on the environment 4 or 5 years ago, and an environmentalist won it. And last year we also had a claim on the Pulitzer Prize. If I live to be 1,200, we won't do this again, because we had funded a small group with only 7 people who wrote a brilliant report on the leak in the Kalamazoo River. And this year we got the Emmy too for funding an attempted propaganda series on Showtime that nobody watched. Although it was very good and had suitable movie stars, and I have a wonderful 5 minutes in it. Episode 7, all about Tahrir Square and Egyptians. So it's almost our #1 job is finding ways to leverage propaganda. The biggest propaganda is leveraged 70-1, which is aimed through China and receives free government TV time, and has wonderfully elegant kind of California-style ads using 7-foot basketball players and kung fu heroes to get to the Chinese 5 things to do on climate and about rhino horn and so on. Within the NGO world, which we're pretty involved with, many are really struggling with this issue. The Audubon Society is one of the few that can boast or can claim 40% non-Democrats. And they've made the first of that kind of group to say firm and flatly, it's climate change, it's man-made, your birds are threatened, get on the website and you can check your favorite bird, and half of them are under serious shrinking of their habitats, and some will go out of business. And they talked their friends at the gardening club. And these are 800,000 members, but both of them, 800,000, are really ferocious. And they're also bipartisan, which sadly some of the extreme groups like Greenpeace, which we also support, are not. So there's a lot going on. It's an uphill struggle, and it's absolutely critical.
Thank you so much for your scaring us to death here. I work with Citizens Climate Lobby, and we are working for a revenue-neutral carbon fee and dividend in order to get the market to finally correct its distortionary failure to incorporate the damaging prices of climate change into the price of the fuels. You mentioned pricing carbon once in your talk, and so my question is, how do we work the concept of getting money to work with us as a civilization rather than against us as a civilization?
Yeah, that's the question.
Do you have an answer?
Step by step, the hard way. Like the old ad, you know, we earn our money the old-fashioned way. We work for it. And yeah, there will be some clever tricks, and they will be worth their weight in gold. But mainly it will be blocking and tackling. And that's the best I can say.
This conference is sponsored by the Center for Collective Intelligence. Most of the resources that you graphed are physical resources. However, in your two main strategies, the second was technological innovation. Insofar as Julian Simon and others have an argument that the human resource, the human capability of using our collective intelligence to address problems can overcome things, how would you go about fostering the collective intelligence that's so manifest here?
Unfortunately, I blocked at the Simons thing. Fortunately, my quarterly letter out today or Monday has a little section on Simons. A couple of years ago, I was irritated enough to do an appendix on him. Simons and Ehrlich. Ehrlich said, things run out, the prices will rise. Simons said, the infinite capacity of the human brain and prices will fall forever and we'll always find replacements. A nice dichotomy. Simons, funded by the Cato Institute, that was founded by the Koch brothers. It always raises my suspicion when you've got odd people funding think tanks. Anyway, the best test of that is to let the prices run forever. That's what they're saying. They had to put 10 years on it because they were old guys and one of them might die and did. And they wanted to live to have a test. And at the end of 10 years, Simon had won 4 out of 5, and so he got paid off. I extended that until 2 years ago, and Ehrlich had won 4 out of 5. And if you extended it to the real spirit of the exercise, which is all commodities, it was a complete rout. The prices, since the day they made the bet, had all gone up a lot. So the Simons-Ehrlich thing is a blooming hoax, and I'm sick of hearing about it. I'm so sorry to get carried away on this. I didn't hear the question.
I should have never mentioned his name. But the main point is, insofar as collective intelligence is part of the solution, what would you do to promote collective intelligence?
I don't know. I have no ingenious idea for collective intelligence. I'm hoping someone else would have. Let me try another one. Perhaps I can do better.
It seems to me that although we're under incredible threat of extinction here eventually, that there is perhaps an opportunity for American corporations, the American government, and the American people to step up in some way and lead the 100% renewable energy revolution. Do you have any exciting, great ideas on how we might rally the American people in terms of their consciousness and concern and commitment?
So I'm getting the same question, and I can say with a clear conscience that we think it is the question, and we're trying everything that we can think of. And it just isn't easy, and there is no magic has yet appeared. There may be one day. Let me just add, by the way, that the US military and the UK military are noble exceptions to all my criticisms. They completely get the long-term problems of resource limitations, particularly of oil limitations, and of climate change, and of all the problems, and destabilizing. For them, Egypt being destabilized is not an abstraction as it is to the typical American. For them, it means trouble down the road, and that becomes their responsibility. So at least one part of what loosely is described as the establishment gets it. They are, of course, derided by the new boss of the Senate for wasting their time on kind of left-wing politics because they think it's their job to protect the country against long-term threats. But that's where we've come to.
Hi, Brad Johnson. I want to thank you for your, I find your speech inspiring, and I really appreciated that you mentioned MIT's deep relationship with the oil industry.
I'm a busy guy. I didn't want to be invited again. No.
Oh no, my master's in climate science here was part of a program that was funded by the oil industry. So my practical question, going back to your hats, is the Nature Conservancy is one of the most powerful and certainly wealthiest environmental organizations in the world, and its board, which includes you, also includes people not only whose wealth came from the fossil fuel, but are currently and actively investing in exploiting our fossil fuel resources from fracking and oil and the like. And there's the Koch brothers have given money to the Nature Conservancy. And I'm wondering if that's something that you think needs to change, either specifically on the Nature Conservancy or in terms of groups that claim to care about climate change more broadly.
One of the reasons I joined was I thought would be nice for me to help move them on climate change. They have been buyers and protectors of beautiful places in America. They have a chapter system, state by state. They have some really deep red chapters, Texas, so on. And they buy lots of terrific land, and they've done a great job over the years. So it's an inherently difficult herd of cats here to make any sense out of. The central office runs a much smaller, like $150 million program, about as big as anybody else, but doesn't dwarf them. The real money goes to buying all that land, American land, basically. The programs are aimed all over the world. It's time they took a stand on climate change. And the board is absolutely in favor. I could not believe it. And this is off the record, ho-ho. But the board was unanimous in saying we should become a leader. Now, it's going to take a while with these wild and woolly chapters out there who are very important, doing good stuff. But we're on a roll. David Blood, who works with the Al Gore, doing green stuff investing, is on the board. It's changed a lot, and I'm absolutely shocked. The problem is not the board. The problem is the structure, the complexity, and taking an organization too far away from its roots is dangerous. And it's not broken. It does work. So you don't want to break it in the process of some quixotic. You have to do it carefully and sensibly. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Jeremy, for an amazing talk. I have two quick announcements and one final comment before we leave today. First, the winners who are here today, we have some certificates for all of you. If you can stop by the winners registration table when you leave, you can pick them up there. Second, I want to thank some of the people who made this conference possible. First, I want to just ask to stand again the two people I introduced at the beginning of the conference yesterday. If you thought this was a good conference, the two people you should really thank are Rob Laubacher and Laura Fisher. And they were assisted by a very able team of almost all volunteers, including, and if these people are in the room right now, could you please stand when I call your name, including Julie Sikorska. Is she here? Patrick DeBoer, who is not in the room. Manuel Thurner, is he here? Michael Houle, is he here? Nancy Taubenslag, is she here? And Richard Hill. I don't know if Richard is here, but congratulations to him. So my final closing comment to you is about what we can all do. I think almost all of us in the room today probably believe that global climate change is one of the most important problems facing our human species. Not just a problem for us, but for our children and for our children's children. Before we leave, I'd like to just give one thought about the question that Jeremy said he didn't know the answer to, which is how we can use our collective intelligence to deal with this problem. As I said before I introduced Jeremy, one of the things that was most exciting to me about this conference was seeing the connections between the people who are here in person today. And as you know, we have a community of tens of thousands of people all over the world who are also part of this community. So it seems to me, in addition to the kinds of things Jeremy was just talking about, one of the most important reasons for optimism is because of the possibilities of what can happen with this community of people that we are all now a part of, this collectively intelligent network that we are helping to create today. So my hope is that we, as a species, will be able to use our global collective intelligence to make choices about our environment that are not just smart, but also wise. Thank you all very much.